The trucks rattled to a stop, dust swirling in the hot air as the women inside shifted nervously. German prisoners, their faces pale from hunger and fear, clutched their thin coats tighter as American guards ordered them to climb down. For days they had whispered to one another about what awaited them. Propaganda had filled their ears for years, stories of brutal treatment, torture, and humiliation at the hands of the Americans. Some expected to be worked to death, others to vanish behind barbed wire forever. As they stepped onto the gravel of the camp, they braced for cruelty. The barbed wire fence loomed tall and unyielding, casting long shadows in the afternoon sun. Watchtowers stood at the corners, guards silhouetted against the sky. The women walked in silence, their boots crunching on the gravel, their eyes fixed on the ground. The camp seemed quiet, unnervingly so. The air carried no scent of bread or coffee, only dust and tension. One woman whispered, "This is the end." Her voice cracked as if she already felt the weight of her fate. And then suddenly a sound broke through the silence. At first faint, drifting across the compound like a breeze, it grew stronger with every step. A trumpet blared, bright and swinging, followed by the steady rhythm of drums and the warm swell of a saxophone. Jazz. American jazz, the very music banned back home in Germany as degenerate. The women froze. Some raised their heads in shock, others exchanged bewildered glances. Inside the recreation hall, an American military band was rehearsing, their laughter mingling with the music. Notes of Benny Goodman and Glenn Miller filled the camp with an energy that none of the prisoners could have anticipated. To hear music at all was shocking enough, but to hear music so free, so alive, so unlike the martial marches drilled into their heads, was almost incomprehensible. As the women were guided toward their barracks, the music followed them, echoing off the wooden walls and wire fences. One prisoner later wrote that in that moment, the world turned upside down. "I thought I would hear screams," she recalled, "but instead I heard laughter and music. It was as though defeat had a soundtrack, and it was not horror, it was jazz. The surprises did not end there." That evening, a guard mentioned casually that a film would be screened in the recreation hall. The women exchanged confused stares. Surely prisoners were not invited to watch movies. Yet as dusk fell, a projector whirred to life, casting flickering images onto a white sheet. It was not propaganda or punishment, but a Hollywood comedy, filled with laughter, romance, and scenes of ordinary American life. The prisoners sat quietly, some skeptical, others captivated. They had expected torture, humiliation, and silence. Instead, they were handed a window into another world, a world of abundance, freedom, and joy, projected onto a screen and carried on the notes of music that had been forbidden in their homeland. For the German women, this was the beginning of an unsettling realization. The Americans fought not only with tanks and guns, but with culture, with rhythm, with sound, with stories that made life seem vibrant, even in wartime. And that realization, more than any guard's command, began to dismantle everything they thought they knew about their enemy. By the final years of the war, the German home front was a place of deprivation and control. Cities lay in ruins from relentless Allied bombing campaigns, ration books dictated every meal, and the radio poured out carefully monitored messages of endurance and sacrifice. Music was strictly policed. Jazz, swing, and blues were denounced as degenerate, corrupt influences from America and its allies, unfit for a disciplined people. Instead, martial marches and patriotic anthems filled the airwaves, reinforcing the sense that Germany's survival depended on iron discipline and total conformity. For women in the Reich, the war brought crushing demands. Some served as auxiliaries in communications, hospitals, or offices, while others labored in factories or struggled to keep families alive under rationing. Propaganda told them that capture by the enemy would mean dishonor at best and torture at worst. The Americans, they were told, were decadent cowards, dangerous in their corruption and merciless in their treatment of prisoners. Many women believed that captivity would mean cruelty, perhaps worse than death. Reality would soon dismantle those expectations. As German forces surrendered in waves during 1944 and 1945, thousands of women were swept up in the collapse. Shipped to camps in the United States and Britain, they prepared themselves for hardship. Instead, they encountered something stranger, a regime of order mixed with humanity, where guards enforced rules but often treated prisoners with civility. The real shock, however, was cultural. America's wealth was impossible to conceal. Even behind barbed wire, German women heard the sounds of abundance, music playing on radios, bands rehearsing, and movie projectors humming to life at night. To women raised on years of Nazi propaganda, these sounds were profoundly disorienting. They had expected silence, suffering, and fear. What they found instead was jazz. Jazz and swing represented everything the Nazi regime had tried to stamp out: improvisation, freedom, rhythm, and joy. To hear it in captivity was like stepping into another world. Prisoners described the shock of their first exposure, the brass instruments blaring, the saxophones weaving, the drums snapping in a rhythm that felt alive in a way German marches never had. It was more than music. It was a revelation that America's spirit was not broken by war, but amplified by it. Then came the movies. For prisoners accustomed to a tightly controlled media, the experience of watching a Hollywood film was electrifying. The stories were often light-hearted, comedies, romances, musicals, but the impact was heavy. On screen they saw ordinary Americans falling in love, struggling with family, or dancing across a stage. Even in wartime, America projected an image of normalcy and hope. For German women whose last glimpses of home were bombed-out ruins and hunger, the contrast was staggering. The introduction of entertainment into camp life was not incidental. The U.S. military recognized that morale was vital, not only for its own soldiers, but also in managing prisoners. Music, movies, and cultural programs kept tensions low, reduced resistance, and demonstrated America's confidence. But for the prisoners, these acts carried far greater meaning. They shattered myths. They revealed a nation that did not merely survive war, but thrived in ways the Reich could not imagine. In this clash between expectation and reality, donuts and Coca-Cola had already surprised many prisoners. But jazz and movies struck deeper. They reached into the imagination, offering not just food for the body, but visions for the mind. They proved that America's power lay not only in its weapons, but in its culture, a culture that could win hearts as effectively as it won battles. For German women POWs, the realization was both humbling and unforgettable. They had stepped into captivity braced for torture. Instead, they found themselves tapping their feet to forbidden rhythms and watching films that made them laugh. And in those moments, they began to grasp the true scale of America's strength. The first days of captivity were filled with dread. For German women prisoners, every sight, the barbed wire, the watchtowers, the armed guards, seemed to confirm their fears. They clung to each other, whispering the warnings they had heard so often back home. Americans were dangerous, Americans would humiliate them, Americans had no honor. Some even braced themselves for physical abuse, certain that torture or starvation awaited them just beyond the gates. Yet almost immediately, small cracks appeared in that grim expectation. Guards barked orders, yes, but their tone was not dripping with malice. Prisoners were searched but not beaten. Food was distributed according to schedule, not withheld as punishment. In those first uneasy hours, the women realized that cruelty was not automatic. Confusion replaced terror, and questions began to form in their minds. The first great shock came in the form of sound. Late one afternoon, as the women settled into their new barracks, a strange rhythm drifted through the compound. At first it was faint, a snare drum tapping, a trumpet warming up, the low hum of a saxophone. Then suddenly the music burst into life, a lively swing tune, bright and infectious, carried by brass and drums. The women froze. It was jazz. For years, jazz had been condemned as degenerate by the Reich. Posters denounced it as Neger music, unfit for civilized society, a symbol of American weakness and corruption. Listening to it in Germany had been dangerous, sometimes punishable. Yet here it was, flowing freely from an American military band rehearsing just beyond the camp fence. The women did not know whether to recoil or to listen. Some covered their ears, embarrassed by the sheer audacity of it. Others leaned closer to the walls, straining to hear. Within minutes, a strange transformation occurred. Toes began to tap, hands drummed against knees, and lips curled into smiles they had not felt in months. The rhythm was irresistible. It carried a freedom that contrasted painfully with the rigid marches of the Reich. One woman later recalled, it was like hearing color after years of gray. The shock of jazz went deeper than music. It was a cultural confrontation. The prisoners had been told America was weak, yet here was a sound so confident, so joyful, that it made the idea of American weakness seem absurd. How could a decadent, crumbling society produce something so vibrant? The music alone planted doubt. A few days later, the women encountered their second cultural shock. A projector had been set up in the recreation hall, and that evening, guards invited prisoners to attend a film screening. The women filed in hesitantly, certain it was a trap or perhaps propaganda. Instead, the white sheet on the wall lit up with a Hollywood comedy. Actors danced, laughed, and fell in love. Scenes of bustling American streets, bright restaurants, and couples smiling at each other filled the room. For the German women, the experience was surreal. They had left behind cities reduced to rubble, homes without food, families struggling to survive under bombs. On the screen, America seemed untouched by war, a land of plenty where people still dressed smartly and fell in love under neon lights. Some prisoners wept quietly, overwhelmed by the contrast. Others watched in silence, their minds racing with questions. Was this real life in America? Could it be true that while Germany starved, Americans still enjoyed movies, music, and laughter? The combination of jazz and movies was devastating to Nazi propaganda. It was not just that the prisoners were treated decently. It was that they were exposed to a culture their leaders had tried to erase. The forbidden rhythms, the glamorous actors, the easy smiles, all revealed a world that contradicted everything they had been taught. Testimonies from former prisoners capture the depth of this shock. One wrote, "I had feared beatings. Instead, I heard music. I had feared starvation. Instead, I watched a film. Everything they told us was wrong." Another remembered the laughter in the hall as a comedy unfolded on the screen. "We laughed with the Americans, though we did not know them." It was the strangest feeling, to laugh with the enemy. The everyday details of camp life reinforced these experiences. Guards sometimes left radios playing in the background. USO shows occasionally visited larger camps, filling the air with swing bands and comic sketches. Red Cross volunteers, many of them women, distributed magazines and books, some of which included photographs of American culture. Smiling families, advertisements for products, glamorous stars. Each glimpse added to the growing realization: America was not desperate, America was not weak. America was thriving. For German women who had grown up under strict censorship, this exposure was destabilizing. At home, films were tightly controlled by Goebbels' ministry. Music was censored, books banned. In captivity, they encountered a flood of the very culture they had been shielded from, and the contrast was intoxicating. They realized that culture itself could be a weapon, not one that destroyed cities, but one that destroyed lies. By the end of their first weeks in captivity, many women began to adjust. They still feared the unknown, still worried for their families back home. But something had shifted. The Americans had not tortured them. Instead, they had offered donuts, cigarettes, jazz, and movies. The contradictions gnawed at their old certainties, leaving them to question everything they thought they knew. The first signs of shock were unmistakable. What began with the simple expectation of cruelty had turned into something far stranger. A discovery that the enemy's music and stories could feel more human, more alive than the rigid culture they had left behind. As weeks passed, the rhythms of camp life became familiar. The women woke at dawn, lined up for roll call, worked assigned tasks, and returned to barracks in the evening. On the surface, it was the expected structure of captivity. But beneath that structure, something unexpected grew. The women found themselves surrounded by cultural experiences they had never imagined encountering as prisoners of war. Music was everywhere. Radios in the guard stations played popular American broadcasts, often loud enough for prisoners to hear through open windows. On Sundays, military bands performed rehearsals that carried across the compound, trumpets and saxophones cutting through the monotony of daily life. At first, some women tried to resist, muttering that it was enemy noise, yet the rhythms of swing proved irresistible. Fingers tapped against wooden bunks, lips mouthed unfamiliar melodies, and soon laughter began to fill spaces once haunted by silence. The cultural shock was immense. Back in Germany, jazz and swing had been outlawed as dangerous, corrupting forces. The Reich insisted such music was an attack on discipline, a poison from foreign influences. Now these women sat behind barbed wire, listening to it freely, even casually. as though it were the most natural thing in the world. One woman later wrote, "We had been told that Americans were corrupt because they loved jazz, but to us it sounded like life itself. It was freedom set to music." Movies deepened the experience. Twice a week, the recreation hall transformed into a theater. A projector buzzed, the lights dimmed, and the prisoners were shown Hollywood films. Sometimes they were comedies, sometimes romances, sometimes musicals filled with glittering costumes and cheerful songs. For women who had last seen Germany's propaganda reels, the contrast was breathtaking. On screen, people laughed easily, danced freely, and kissed without shame. The very idea of joy in the middle of war was alien to them. The films also revealed something deeper. They presented a society of abundance. Women in dresses made from fine fabric, men driving cars, families dining together in restaurants, all seemed to mock the reality of Germany's shortages. To prisoners who remembered waiting hours in bread lines or watching children scavenge for scraps, the screen images were like visions of another planet. And yet, here they were in American hands, watching those images as if invited into that other world. The American guards and volunteers understood the effect, though they rarely spoke of it. By exposing prisoners to jazz and movies, they not only reduced tensions in the camp, but also sent a message: this is who we are, and we are not afraid to show it. It was psychological warfare, but in its softest form. Instead of breaking wills through cruelty, it undermined ideology through generosity and culture. The women began to change in subtle ways. Conversations in the barracks shifted. Instead of whispering about torture, they debated the films they had seen. Was the romance believable? Was the music too loud? Were the American fashions beautiful or excessive? Instead of bracing for brutality, they found themselves discussing which band had the catchiest melody. Even their posture shifted. Shoulders once hunched with fear straightened, as they realized their lives were not in constant danger. Some guards noticed the transformation. They seemed lighter, one recalled. The music and movies took their minds somewhere else. It made them human again, not just prisoners. That humanity worked both ways. For the American personnel, seeing enemy women laughing at a comedy or humming along to Glenn Miller blurred the stark lines of propaganda. For the prisoners, discovering kindness and culture in their enemy blurred those same lines. Not all accepted it easily. A minority clung stubbornly to Nazi ideology, dismissing the entertainment as manipulation. They scolded others for enjoying it, warning that to laugh at an American film was to betray their homeland. Yet even those dissenting voices could not erase the smiles, the laughter, the tapping feet. The majority quietly embraced the relief these moments offered. For many of the women, the cultural exposure planted seeds that would outlast their captivity. Years later, some recalled their first jazz performance in an American camp as the moment they realized propaganda had lied. Others remembered films not for the stories themselves, but for the glimpses of ordinary American life. Women shopping in busy stores, families eating together, soldiers dancing before shipping out. Those images stayed with them, shaping how they thought about America long after the war. One particularly powerful memory came from a woman who, during her captivity, saw her first musical. She wrote, "We had lived in silence broken only by air raid sirens. Then in captivity, I saw a film where people sang while they worked and danced in the streets. It seemed impossible, yet it showed me that life could be lived differently. It was the first time I believed that joy might be possible again." These experiences marked a turning point. The women no longer simply compared their fears of torture to the reality of decent treatment. They began comparing their old life under the Reich to the glimpses of American life projected through culture. And in that comparison, Germany's control looked brittle, while America's freedom looked irresistible. The second phase of captivity, then, was not about survival. It was about revelation. Through jazz and movies, the prisoners learned that America fought with more than weapons. It fought with ideas, with culture, with stories and rhythms that could penetrate even the hardest indoctrination. By the time 1945 drew to a close, the initial shock of captivity had given way to a deeper reckoning. For the German women in American POW camps, the constant presence of jazz and movies did more than entertain them. It forced them to confront the collapse of the world they once believed in. What began as surprise had turned into reflection, and reflection carried consequences that would echo long after the war. The first consequence was the collapse of fear. In the early days, fear had been overwhelming, fear of starvation, of abuse, of humiliation. But the steady rhythm of camp life, punctuated by laughter and music, chipped away at that dread. Instead of bracing for blows, the women began to look forward to movie nights or to the distant sound of a band rehearsing. Fear, once their constant companion, was gradually replaced by an unsettling curiosity about America itself. That curiosity gave rise to the second consequence, doubt. Nazi propaganda had been absolute. It had insisted that America was a land of decadence, incapable of discipline, corroded by greed and moral weakness. But how could such a land produce music so alive, so confident? How could it project films that showed families eating plentiful meals, couples dancing, and soldiers laughing? The propaganda crumbled under the weight of lived experience. The women could not reconcile the reality of jazz, echoing across the camp with the caricature of American corruption. Testimonies recorded years later reveal how powerful this realization was. One former POW wrote, "We had been told that Americans were hollow, without spirit, but in captivity, I heard their spirit in every note of their music. It was undeniable." Another recalled, "When I saw a film in which a soldier kissed his bride before going to war, I realized that America fought not only with weapons, but with love. It was something our leaders had denied us." The third consequence was cultural transformation. Slowly, the women absorbed elements of the culture around them. Some began humming jazz tunes as they worked. Others mimicked lines from American films, laughing as they practiced English words picked up from the screen. A few even tried to copy hairstyles or fashions they saw in magazines distributed by the Red Cross. These small acts of imitation were harmless in the camps, but carried immense symbolic weight. They showed that the prisoners were no longer merely surviving. They were adapting, even adopting elements of a culture once condemned as the enemy's. Guilt accompanied this transformation. Letters from home painted a bleak picture. Families freezing in bombed-out ruins, children starving, cities reduced to rubble. Meanwhile, the women sat in clean barracks, listening to jazz and watching comedies. Some felt ashamed to enjoy these comforts, while their families suffered. One prisoner admitted in her diary, "We laughed at a film while my mother in Hamburg surely cried for bread. I could not reconcile the two worlds." That guilt made the cultural impact even stronger, because it underscored the contrast between Germany's collapse and America's resilience. The consequences extended beyond the fences of the camps. When the war ended and prisoners were repatriated, many carried their memories of jazz and movies back to Germany. In the ruins of Cologne, Munich, and Berlin, they described to friends and families the strange abundance of American captivity. Their stories sowed curiosity about America, and when the occupation brought an influx of American culture, records, films, Coca-Cola, it felt less alien. For many, it was a continuation of what they had already experienced behind barbed wire. This cultural exposure also played a role in reshaping post-war identities. Some of the women who had been prisoners later admitted that the music and movies planted seeds of democracy in their minds. They had seen a society where culture flourished freely, without censorship, and where entertainment seemed to thrive even in wartime. In contrast, they remembered the rigidity of Nazi Germany, where joy had been subordinated to ideology. Those memories shaped how they viewed Germany's future. The Americans may not have intended such long-term influence, but it was undeniable. By treating their prisoners humanely and exposing them to culture, they had created living witnesses to the power of American soft power. These women returned home carrying stories that undermined Nazi myths and fueled the growing fascination with American culture in the post-war years. Of course, not every prisoner was swayed. Some clung stubbornly to resentment, dismissing jazz as chaos and films as shallow distractions. Yet even they could not erase the memory of tapping feet and laughter in the barracks. The sounds and images had seeped into their minds, whether they admitted it or not. The consequences then were layered. Fear gave way to curiosity. Propaganda gave way to doubt. Doubt gave way to cultural transformation, and cultural transformation gave way to long-term influence that would ripple through post-war Germany. For the German women who lived it, captivity had been expected to bring suffering. Instead, it had brought something far stranger, the realization that their enemies' music and movies could shake their beliefs more effectively than any weapon. In the end, jazz and cinema became the quiet conquerors of their hearts. It was a late summer evening in 1945 when the camp guards announced something unusual. Instead of the usual work details and lights out, the prisoners were told there would be a performance in the open field near the barracks. Skeptical and uneasy, groups of German women filed out, their faces weary, their uniforms faded from weeks of wear. Many whispered to each other, convinced this was some sort of trick, some humiliation designed to remind them of their defeat. But what they saw left them silent. At the far end of the field, an American military band was setting up. Saxophones gleamed in the fading sunlight, a trombone slid back and forth as a soldier warmed up, and the low hum of a stand-up bass echoed across the camp. When the drummer tapped his sticks together and the first brassy notes of a swing tune rang out, the women froze. This was no military march. This was jazz, fast, joyful, defiant, unlike anything their homeland had allowed them to hear. Some women crossed their arms, trying to resist the rhythm. Propaganda still echoed in their ears. Jazz was degenerate, born of chaos, the sound of a decadent world. But their feet betrayed them. Toes tapped, heads nodded. Within minutes, the resistance melted. Laughter rippled through the crowd as the music reached a fever pitch. A prisoner whispered to her companion, "We thought we'd face cruelty. Instead, they give us this?" Another muttered in disbelief, "If this is defeat, it doesn't feel like it." The Americans played as though the war had never happened. One soldier, grinning broadly, swung his trumpet high, blasting notes into the night sky. Another danced in place as he strummed his bass. The energy was contagious. Even the guards, normally stoic, swayed to the beat. For the prisoners, it was a revelation. They had expected punishment, silence, and despair. Instead, they found themselves swept into a wave of rhythm that made them feel, if only for a moment, like human beings again. The music ended in thunderous applause. Applause not only from the Americans, but, to the women's own surprise, from themselves. They clapped, shouted, and even whistled, as though the weight of captivity had lifted. Some wept quietly, overwhelmed by the release of emotions they had suppressed for years. And then came the second act. A movie projector flickered to life. Onto a makeshift screen appeared scenes of an American musical. Couples dancing, crowds laughing, singers belting out joyful tunes. The prisoners gasped. They had never seen such abundance on display. In Germany, the war had meant rationing, hunger, and silence. Here, in the heart of their enemy's camp, they were confronted with a vision of life so colorful, so carefree, that it seemed like another world entirely. One prisoner turned to her friend and whispered, "We thought our guns made us strong. But look, this is stronger." Her words captured the moment perfectly. The realization spread among them. America's true strength was not only in tanks and planes, but in its ability to create joy, to project confidence even in the midst of global war. The night ended with silence, not because the prisoners were unmoved, but because they had no words to capture what they had felt. Their beliefs had been shaken in ways no battlefield defeat ever could. Jazz had reached places where speeches could not. A film had shown them a life their own leaders had stolen from them. In that moment, the last remnants of propaganda dissolved. The day German women POWs expected torture, but instead found jazz and movies became a turning point. It was the moment they realized they were not merely captives, they were witnesses to a world beyond dictatorship, a world that fought not only with weapons, but with music, laughter, and light. As the war drew to a close and the women settled into the rhythm of captivity, a truth emerged that none of them had expected. They had entered the camps braced for violence, convinced that the enemy would repay cruelty with cruelty. Instead, they found music, movies, and a strange kind of dignity that their own army had denied them. What began as disbelief slowly turned into a deeper realization. America's strength was not only in its weapons, but in its culture and its confidence. For many of these women, jazz became the first sound of freedom. The forbidden rhythms they had once been taught to despise now filled their nights with energy, laughter, and even hope. Movies projected on makeshift screens showed them glimpses of a society where ordinary people lived with abundance, joy, and choices, images that felt as revolutionary as any political speech. Where they had expected to be broken, they were instead confronted with possibilities. Letters and memoirs written years later revealed how powerful those impressions had been. Some women admitted that their entire view of the war shifted during captivity. They saw that the stories they had been told about Americans as weak, decadent, and dangerous were lies. Instead, they encountered a nation that treated its prisoners with a humanity absent from their own system. The irony was unavoidable. Behind the barbed wire, they often felt freer than they had in uniform under the Reich. The cultural shock also had lasting consequences beyond the camps. After the war, many former POWs returned to Germany, carrying not only memories of donuts, coffee, jazz, and Hollywood, but also a sense of how life could be different. They spoke to families and communities about what they had seen, planting small seeds of change. In the years that followed, when Germany rebuilt under Allied occupation, American culture, music, movies, even consumer goods spread like wildfire. For some, it was a reminder of captivity, but for others it was a vision of a future unshackled from dictatorship. What makes this story remarkable is not just the kindness shown to defeated prisoners, but the effect it had on those who experienced it. The Americans did not need to brutalize or break their captives. By offering them humanity and even entertainment, they won a battle of perception. They revealed that the values of freedom and abundance were not just slogans, but everyday realities. In the end, the day German women POWs expected torture, but found jazz and movies instead, was more than an anecdote of war. It was a symbol of a deeper truth. Wars are not only fought with steel and fire, but with ideas, culture, and the simple act of treating others with dignity. And perhaps that is why, decades later, survivors remembered the swing of a saxophone and the flicker of a projector more vividly than the sound of artillery. For in those unexpected moments, they realized that their world had been built on lies, and that another, brighter one was possible. The story leaves us with a haunting question. If music and movies could shake the convictions of those raised under totalitarian rule, what other small human gestures can change the course of history? The answer lies in the power of culture itself. And as we move forward in this series, we will explore how those cultural shocks, ice cream, Coca-Cola, jazz, and cinema, helped America win not only the war, but the peace that followed.